So today we're going to talk about Chapter 2, Why People Commit Fraud. And through this chapter, we're going to talk about the types of people that commit fraud, explain why they commit fraud, we'll describe the fraud triangle, and talk about the fraud scale, and then understand the pressures, the opportunity, and rationalizations that go into fraud, and which is the fraud triangle, and then understand how people are recruited to participate in fraud schemes. So first off is, who are the type of people that commit fraud? Well, basically anyone, right? Because the people that commit fraud are people like you and me. They're generally people who have been trusted through most of their lives. They've been trusted individuals, and that's how they got in a position of trust. They gave them the opportunity to commit fraud. They don't look like gang members. They don't look like pirates, for example, or other people that we might associate with crime. They look very similar to you and me. They generally are college educated, have a family, they're middle-aged, that they've been able to work a period of time in an organization to get into a position of trust. And so they fit the profile of an honest individual. So they don't look altogether different than you and me. So we're going to talk about what causes some individuals to commit fraud versus others. Well, the first the reason why people commit fraud has been boiled down into a theory called the fraud triangle. And we've probably talked about, or at least you've all heard about the fraud triangle in the past. It's pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. And the fraud triangle came out, it sort of developed over time. And it was all based on research by a professor named Donald Cressy. And Cressy came along after another researcher named Edwin Sutherland. And Edwin Sutherland was researching criminology and psychology and trying to understand why people committed crime. And, in the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, the criminologists, the psychologists, they thought people committed crime because they were desperate. They were committing acts of desperation. But then Edwin Sutherland noticed that, these people there's a lot of people who are just out there committing fraud at their organization. So they're committing crime, but they're not desperate. They may be greedy. There may be other things involved with why they're committing fraud, but these are generally wealthy individuals already who are in a position of trust. He called them white-collar criminals, right? People who went to work with a white collar on. They worked in an office, and they stole corporate assets as part of their business, as part of their occupation. So he was rethinking the theory of why people commit crime. And Donald Cressy sort of followed Edwin Sutherland, and he wanted to really understand what's causing these people to work at an organization where they're a trusted individual and then steal from the organization. So he went to prison and talked to a lot of former embezzlers, people who had been convicted of embezzling. And as he talked to them, he took notes, and he sort of developed some common themes between the narratives that these embezzlers were giving to him. And he didn't call it the fraud triangle, but he came up with basically three reasons or things that cause people to commit fraud. One was opportunity, right? They had the ability to do it. They're in a position of trust, and they had an opportunity to steal corporate assets. The other was what he called a non-shareable problem. Is these people, they all had different reasons for why they did it, but the reasons were usually something they didn't want to share with somebody else. So maybe they had a gambling debt. Maybe they had a mistress that they were, spending excess money on. Could be that they were addicted to drugs. So they had some problem that they feel like they could not share with others. If you or I need money, maybe if we want to buy a house, we go to a bank and get a mortgage. For students, and we need to fix our car, maybe we ask our parents and say, hey, my car broke down. Can you loan me some money or pay for it? Well, individuals who embezzled, the reason for needing money, they didn't feel like they could share with somebody else. And so he called this a non-shareable problem. But he said these individuals consider themselves honest individuals, trustworthy individuals. They didn't see themselves as criminals. Right? They weren't members of a gang. They weren't members of a drug cartel. They weren't members of the mafia, for example. And so they didn't feel like they were dishonest individuals. So to be able to steal corporate assets and not feel bad about it, they had to find a way to tell themselves it was okay. Right? And what he found out that most of these embezzlers told themselves that they were just borrowing the money. So they said, bad people steal money, but good people borrow money. And I'm just going to borrow from my employer because I have this opportunity maybe to take petty cash out of the drawer, and then I'll just put it back. I'll take the petty cash, I'll pay off my gambling debt, and then I'll put it back, next week, and nobody will know. And that became, the main rationalization, that they were just going to borrow the money. But there were others, and Cressy noticed that people generally had a non-shareable problem. They had the opportunity to steal, and they just told themselves somehow that it was okay. And the psychologists call this rationalization. They have it called techniques of neutralization. They're able to neutralize their bad feelings. Sometimes it's called cognitive dissonance when you want to do something you know is wrong. Right? And so you have to somehow relieve that dissonance in your mind and tell yourself it's okay. Right? And the problem, though, with fraud is once these embezzlers were able to successfully embezzle money, well, they don't pay it back. Right? They start gambling more, and then the fraud gets bigger and bigger. They couldn't make ends meet because they had some financial need early on, and they were able to steal and not get caught. They don't pay it back. They just keep doing it. So that's why the theorists say there's no immaterial fraud. There's just undiscovered fraud because it's going to get bigger if it goes undetected. So over time, Cressy's theory, this non-shareable problem, this opportunity, this rationalization, turned into what researchers now call the fraud triangle. So instead of saying non-shareable problem, they say there's some perceived pressure. And sometimes it's called incentive. So you have some incentive or some pressure that's causing you to feel like you need some money. And you see this perceived opportunity, you think you can do it without getting caught. And all you have to do is rationalize your behavior. Sometimes the fraud triangle uses attitude instead of rationalization. They use the word attitude because some people don't need to rationalize. They're dishonest. And so they'll take the money given the opportunity. But most of us, feel like we're honest individuals. And so to be able to do something that we know is dishonest, we have to be able to rationalize it to tell ourselves that it's okay. It's not a dishonest thing to do. And the authors of the book relate this to the fraud triangle, or to the Fryer triangle. Like to create fire, you need heat, oxygen, and fuel, right? And they say to commit fraud, you need pressure or incentive, opportunity, and then rationalization, or have an attitude that you just don't care, that you can steal and not feel bad about it. And on this fraud scale, there are situational pressures, right, which you perceive to be low. And if they're low, where you don't have a lot of pressure, there's really good internal controls, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. There's not an opportunity to commit fraud. And the people that are working for you have high personal integrity, and they have an attitude that makes it difficult for them to rationalize bad behavior, or they're essentially honest people. Then fraud's low, right? The likelihood of fraud is really low. But if you have employees that have a lot of situational pressures, and they have, financial needs or vices or other things that cause them to need money, they're in a position where there's poor internal controls. They feel like they can take corporate assets without anybody knowing, and they're able to easily rationalize the behavior, then there's going to be a high risk of fraud within your organization. So the four main pressures related to fraud are your financial pressures, right, your vices, then there's work-related pressure, and there's others. And researchers estimate that approximately 95% of all frauds involve either some financial or vice-related pressure. Right? It's not usually work-related pressure or other types of pressure. Now, the common financial pressures are just straight greed. You can't delay gratification. You want what you want now. So you can't wait until you earn it, so you steal it. Or you're living beyond one's means. And that may be because you have a vice. Maybe you have a gambling problem or other things, but you're just living beyond your means. Or maybe you're trying to keep up with your neighbors and buy new cars and create the illusion of being successful. And that creates high bills or a lot of personal debt, right? That puts pressure on you. You maybe have poor credit because you haven't been able to pay your debts. And so that puts pressure on you you can't get a loan, so you have to get money from some other source, like stealing from your employer. Right? Personal financial losses. Maybe you have gambling losses or investment losses that that have happened to you, and so you have this need, this pressure to take from your employer. And there's other unexpected financial needs. Maybe you have your daughter's sick, you have medical bills, you can't pay for it. So your vice-related pressures, the worst kind of pressure, they say, to commit fraud. Right? That's gambling, gambling addiction, your drug addiction. You may be addicted to alcohol. They say maybe you've got this extramarital relationship that you're spending a lot of money on. So there's vice-related pressures. But these are essentially just a subset of other type of financial pressure that cause you to not make ends meet one month, and so you see an opportunity to commit fraud and you take it. Right? There's a lot of examples in your book about these vice-related pressures. That's where the dad embezzled his son's allowance. I mean, it's really sad stories. The woman who stole money from her employer because their children were addicted to drugs, so she wanted to feed their drug addiction. The man who obviously stole from their employer because he was addicted to drugs. There's a really sad story about a mother of a newborn who was addicted to heroin. She knew that her baby was going to be addicted to heroin, so she was sneaking heroin under the baby's tongue so that the doctors wouldn't realize that the baby was addicted to it, because obviously they knew the baby was addicted to it, a newborn, that the mother was addicted to it. They got it from the mother. So some really sad stories of vice-related pressures. Now, work-related pressures. And that's what Walt Pavlo talked about, like in the Nightline video, was he was feeling a lot of pressure from his job. He was going out trying to collect the accounts receivable from these credit card companies, these calling card companies, and these 1-900 numbers. And some of them are fronts for criminal organizations. Some of them just were poorly run businesses that weren't going to pay him. And so he knew that they were basically stealing from MCI. They really had no intention of paying MCI. So he was mad at them. And then when he told his bosses that they needed to write it off, his bosses said, "No, we're not going to write off those bad debts. That's your job to go out and collect them." So he said it started with a hatred for the customers. Then it was a hatred for his company, basically his employers. And then it was a hatred for himself for staying there and in a bad situation. And then he eventually turned to fraud himself, right? So that's what happens when people feel like they're not getting recognized for the work they're doing. They're dissatisfied in their job, or maybe they're performing poorly and they're worried they're going to lose their job, right? Or they're frustrated because they feel like people are being promoted around them and not them. Then consequently, they feel underpaid. So all these reasons, if you have a bad work environment and your employees are frustrated, it creates the ability to rationalize that, hey, I'm underpaid. I can take from my employer and not feel bad about it because they're taking basically hours from me, overtime hours, and not paying me for it. And so I need to get back at them, right? So those are work-related pressures that can lead to very easy rationalizations to commit fraud. The real-life example is example in your book of the employee who was working 12 to 14 hours a day. And at first, she felt like, well, that's just part of learning on the job. I'm getting an education as I work here. But then over time, as she continued to work a lot of hours, she felt like, I'm not getting paid for this overtime. So she started accepting kickbacks to compensate for the work, the time that she was spending. So the other types of pressure. So maybe your spouse is putting demands on you to remodel the house and buy a new car so they can keep up with the neighbors. Maybe you have a family crisis, like we talked about, medical bills, problems that lead you to believe that I need to bring in some more money somehow to alleviate this life pressure that I have. And then social pressures. That's where greed comes in. You want to look like you're successful, and you're looking around at church and people are driving expensive cars, and you want to do the same. That type of thing can create a lot of pressure, at least perceived pressure, to potentially commit fraud. So if you have the pressure and you have the opportunity, and the things that create opportunities are like lack of internal controls. So we're going to talk about internal controls in a minute. But if there's no controls and you can take corporate assets and people aren't going to realize it. Right? The other thing is then there's an inability to judge performance quality. That's like the situation of your auto mechanic. So you take your car into your mechanic, and it may be something simple to fix, but they tell you there's a lot of things wrong with it, and tell you they did a bunch of work that they really didn't do. And of course, you don't know. You look at the engine, you don't know what's working, what's not working. And so they can overcharge you, overbill you, and you don't know it, right? Because you can't judge the quality of their work, right? That's what there's a Seinfeld episode about that where Jerry took his car into the mechanic, and the mechanic, he felt like he's being overcharged, and George is saying, "Well, of course you are. You walk in there, they say you need a new Johnson rod for your car. You better put in one of those." And so you don't have any idea, you don't have any ability to judge the performance of the mechanic, and so you just pay them whatever they say that for whatever work they say that they did. Right, the failure to discipline fraudsters is a big thing. That's what happens a lot when individuals commit fraud in an organization and they get caught. The organizations typically don't do anything about it. They don't bring a criminal case against them. They don't get law enforcement involved because that's expensive and it's embarrassing. They don't do any. They don't take a civil. They don't file a civil case against the individual to try and recoup the losses, because a lot of times they think, well, the employee, they stole from me, to hire a lawyer to go to court and get a judgment against this person, and the person's probably already sold the assets and spent the money. I'm not even going to be able to collect, even if I do get a judgment. So they just don't discipline or other than fire this potential fraudster. So what they do is they go to another organization, they do the same thing. And you think, well, how can they go from organization to organization? Doesn't the new company call the new employer call the old employer, for a reference check? And the old employer, if they didn't prosecute him for fraud, they didn't find him guilty, then, a court didn't find him guilty, then they can't say they were guilty of fraud. And if they do, then they might be liable for defamation against this individual because they didn't prove it in a court of law. So they usually just, if they call up a previous employer, the previous employer just verifies that they worked there for a period of time, right? So, and then the fraudster goes to that new organization and does the same thing. You also, in an organization, you have to consider the cost of inaction as well, because if you don't prosecute or an employee that stole from you, you have to think of what signal that sends to the other employees, because the other employees, they're going to see that, they caught this person committing fraud and they just fired him, and so they might think, well, the worst thing that can happen is just they get fired, and so they they might be tempted to do the same thing, and it creates a bad environment. But if you as you hire employees, you tell them what's expected of them, and then if you catch an employee stealing from you, you prosecute them criminally and they go to jail, then your other employees are going to think twice about stealing from you again. And so that's the biggest way to reduce fraud in your organization is create the perception of detection, right? And if you make a public example of somebody who does steal from you by bringing a criminal case against them, then other people are going to think twice. So the other thing is lack of access to information. That's similar to the auto mechanic story, where you don't know, you don't have the information to know what the employee is doing, and so maybe there's not an audit trail. Like we'll talk about in a minute, a lack of an audit trail. There's not enough information to document what the employee is doing, so you don't know that they're involved in a fraud. Maybe there's ignorance, apathy, or incapacity. If you're ignorant, to what's going on, and that could be an auto mechanic situation too, where you don't know the quality of work, right? Because you're not a mechanic, so they can tell you something like your car needs a Johnson rod, and you don't have any idea, right? Incapacity is maybe that's what happens to like older people. They're working in, well, there's an example in your book of a hospital nurse who was stealing from patients because the patient was incapacitated, was on the hospital bed, and they were taking money and things out of their purse, and so the person doesn't know. Right? Then a lack of an audit trail. There's not a paper trail, so there's no way to know that a company committed fraud. An employee committed fraud from the company because there's nothing to document what happened. So as far as internal controls, there's an internal control framework that was developed by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, the COSO. So a bunch of organizations like the AICPA got together and developed a framework for internal controls. And their framework starts with the control environment. They said a good internal control system is going to have a good control environment, and then it's going to have a document with the accounting system processes that are in place, and then you're going to put control activities to make sure that the accounting system, all of the elements of the accounting system function properly. So with the control environment, that's the tone at the top. That's the example and the tone that management sets, right? And what management communicates to their employees about what's important, right? And the hiring processes, right? Are they screening employees appropriately? Are they doing reference checks and other things? And that there's a clear organizational structure within the company. And do you have an internal audit department that's following up to make sure that internal controls are being followed, right? So if you think about the internal control environment, the thing to think about is this tone that management sets by doing all of these things. And just to give you an idea of what the tone is, at WorldCom, Jeff Skilling, who was the COO and then eventually the CEO of Enron, his main focus was profitability, right, and stock price. And there was a time when a manager came to Skilling and said, "Hey, I've got an idea, a business idea that Enron should be a part of." And Skilling said, "No, that's a bad idea. Don't do it." Well, the individual sort of knew what Skilling's preferences were, that it was really important that the company, make money. Didn't really feel like Skilling telling her no was necessarily a bad thing. So she went off and did it anyway. And the idea wound up being successful and making a lot of money for Enron. So what does Skilling do? Well, at the next employee meeting, he holds up this employee, this manager, as the type of employee that they want at Enron. And he says, I told her not to do this thing, but she did it anyway, and it's wildly successful, and this is the kind of stick-to-itiveness that we want. The don't take no for an answer attitude that we want from our employees. And she was praised at the employee meeting. And so the tone that sets to management or to other employees is that internal controls just don't matter. Right? So the main thing is that the company, perform and profitability. Right? So if that's the tone that management's setting, you could have all the good internal controls in place that you want, and people aren't going to follow it. Right? So that environment that management sets is a big deal. And you need to communicate that to their employees, right? And what you communicate is the example that you set, right? And you need to have a clear organizational structure, right? So that each employee knows what his or her job responsibilities are, right? Because if you think about this class and you get into a group and think about groups you've been in the past, where if one group member doesn't perform and there's not clear organizational structure, then the group member who cares the most about the grade is going to spend an inordinate amount of time, making up for the slack of another group member, right? And then they're going to get frustrated, and then that's going to create pressure potentially on them to do something. Maybe they're frustrated and that somebody didn't turn in their work, and then they wind up plagiarizing, trying to get through the paper as quickly as they can. Well, that's what happens at organizations when there's people not doing their job and there's not clear defined roles. Then people who care the most wind up doing the most work. They get frustrated, and then they get to the point where, like the lady in the previous example, was working 12 to 14 hours a day on a consistent basis. Probably felt like, why aren't other people working the same and as committed as I am? Right? I'm justified in getting some extra compensation from my employer. Right? And also, if you have an effective internal audit department and management's constantly talking about internal audit and internal audit's following up, and when internal controls are violated, there's mistakes or errors, they're fixing the controls, they're communicating to employees what their responsibilities are. And that's happening on a regular basis, then you're going to have a good control environment. And the key with your internal controls over your external reporting, over your financial statements, is the accounting system. So when transactions are recorded, you want to make sure that valid transactions are recorded, that they're properly authorized. That'll make sure that less likely to be fraud and mistakes, that they're complete. So you want to make sure that for example, all of your sales in your sales journal are not only valid, but all of them are there. Right? There's not missing sales. You want to make sure that things are properly classified. Like, for example, if you have an employee who's working in production, then that employee's time to produce inventory probably should be capitalized into the cost of the inventory. Where the person working in sales who's selling that product, their wages need to go to selling general administrative expenses. So you need a process in place to make sure that expenses in this case are properly classified, that they're reported in the proper period. Right? So if you have sales that are recorded in the next year, so it's January 1st, January 2nd of the following year, those sales, there needs to be a good cutoff, and those sales need to be recorded in the following year. And the inventory that was shipped related to those sales needs to be properly included in ending inventory at December 31st. So you're going to have a lot of internal controls around cutoff to make sure that things are recorded in their proper period. Not only that transactions are properly valued. Right? So if you sell a piece of inventory, that inventory needs to be properly valued and placed into cost of goods sold. And then if there's any summary of summary items, that they're correctly recorded as well. So these are the transactions that occur in the accounting system, and you need to put controls in place to make sure that all of these things happen. Right? And the first control that we think of in terms of internal controls generally is segregation of duties, or dual custody. So dual custody is like you have petty cash, or cash is received by checks are received in the mail. The two people are opening the mail, recording those checks as having been received. Right? When you pay out petty cash, the two people have access to cash at any given time. And then segregation of duties is you want to segregate the responsibility of custody of the assets from the responsibility of authorization, from the responsibility of recording the transaction. So if you have somebody who works in the warehouse, for example, of Dell Computer, those computers that are in the warehouse, they have custody of them. So when somebody orders a computer, they package them up and ship them off. Right? But they shouldn't have any recording responsibility. So if they if they go out and steal computers from the warehouse and take them home, then they shouldn't be able to cover it up. Right? And then when you do an inventory count, they'll be caught because the inventory will wind up being short. Right? But if they also have recording responsibility, so they were able to make journal entries, they could record those the inventory that they stole as some type of expense like shrinkage or obsolescence expense, write out that inventory, and then when they do the count, the count's not different, right, than the recorded record. So the people who have access or custody of assets should be separate from people who have recording responsibility, and that should be separate from people who have authorizing, right, responsibility. So, one person, when you, for example, when you write checks, one person's going to authorize that checks be written, that they start a check run, and then they're going to, as the checks, somebody else is going to actually run the checks. So they have custody of the checks and the printing machine. The printer, they print the checks, and then they put the package with it that shows this check is paying this invoice, for example, or for these expenses. And then a separate individual sits down, they look at the checks that have been written, they look at the documentation for what's being paid, and then they sign the checks. And for dual custody purpose, you have dual signers of the checks. Right? So those duties should be all separate. The authorization versus the recording responsibility versus custody of the assets. Right? And you need to have a system of authorizations. Right? So one person's authorizing the check run, another person's authorizing the checks as they're written. They sign the checks. Right? There needs to be independent checks or safeguards. So if somebody once a month is reconciling the bank statement, then somebody else once a month after there's been a bank reconciliation, it's been reconciled, then somebody else independently checks that and makes sure that it's been done. Right? The other aspect of the control procedure are physical safeguards. Right? So, for example, one of the companies that I audited was a computer chip manufacturer, and they'd weave little gold strands into those chips. Well, they had spools of gold. Well, those spools of gold were kept in a safe inside a locked cage. So they had people who had access. Certain people had access to the cage, and other people had access to the safe. And so they had safeguards around those valuable assets. Right. You also need safeguards, on the warehouse, because even though you may have good segregation of duties, so you have an accounting department who records all the transactions, they're separate individuals from the people who have custody of the assets who work in the warehouse, but you have to be physically segregated as well. So somebody from accounting should not be able to just walk into the warehouse without any authorization, right? So, and the same thing, somebody from the warehouse shouldn't be able to walk out of the warehouse and walk into accounting and have access to the computer terminals to be able to make journal entries, right? So even though the duties might be segregated in terms of the individuals that do it, they also have to be physically separated. Otherwise, somebody from accounting could just walk into the warehouse, take assets, put them in their car, walk back to accounting and write those assets, that inventory off to some expense like scrap, and then keep the assets and nobody would know. And then you also want to have documents and records, right? Obviously, you want to create a paper trail. So when somebody reconciles the bank statement, there's going to be a documentation with the bank statement reconciliation. Somebody else is going to authorize or approve that independently check that reconciliation. And so we need documents and records, right, to create a paper trail. We keep copies of all the checks that we've written, right, so we know who signed the checks, and we get our canceled checks back. So we need these documents and records to keep a paper trail. So the next leg of the triangle is this rationalization element that we talked about, right? And that's where, the second item is I'm only borrowing the money and we'll pay it back, right? That's what Cressy found out the embezzlers generally thought, right? But it could be that I deserve it, right? Like this employee that's working 12 to 14 hours a day feels like she's underappreciated, working overtime, not getting paid for it. So if she takes corporate assets, that's just part of the compensation for working, for working those overtime hours. Nobody will get hurt, right? It's a big organization. I'm not robbing a bank. I'm just taking a little bit of money. They'll never miss it, right? It's for a good purpose. Maybe it's my daughter's medical bills and I need to pay it off, right? So I can take corporate assets because I'm doing a good thing. Right? I pay my fair share of taxes. Or government wastes the money. That's common among government agencies, is that, I'm doing my part. Government wastes money anyway. There's a lot of inefficiencies, and if I take some assets here from government assets, it's no big deal, right? So that's how people are able to rationalize. And so it just has to be some way where you tell yourself what you're doing is okay. You're not essentially being dishonest, because, like I said, these white-collar criminals consider themselves as being honest individuals. Right? And the other thing is, how do you recruit other people to commit fraud? So employee fraud, misappropriation of assets, embezzlement, that usually occurs with one individual. I mean, it's possible that you collude, and you may have the best internal controls in the world and good segregation of duties and a locked warehouse, but somebody who works in the warehouse could still collude with somebody in accounting, and they'll say, we'll steal the computers and you write it off, and then we'll split the proceeds from this theft. So even though good internal controls may be in place, they're not foolproof because of collusion. But most employee frauds are not a result of collusion. It's fraudulent financial reporting is almost always a result of collusion. So the CEO wants to overstate revenue to make the company look better than it really is. How do they recruit the CFO to go along with it? Right? So we're going to talk about that. But in sort of a famous study of CFOs, 67% of the CFOs responded to that they had requests to misrepresent on the financial statement the corporate results. And 55% of them said that they didn't do it, but 12%, by saying that they didn't fight off the request, yielded to that temptation to misreport. Right? So how, for example, is the CEO able to get the CFO or the controller or the accounting manager to participate in a financial statement fraud? Well, one is they just reward them. Right? They just pay them. That's Health South, famous fraud company in Alabama, and the CEO there was Richard Scrushy. And Scrushy, he had, I think, 7 different CFOs that all participated in this fraud over time. And when Health South was caught that they had committed financial statement fraud, the Department of Justice went after Scrushy, and they tried to. The venue of the trial was in Birmingham, and Scrushy, after he was caught, became a bit of a local celebrity because he decided that he'd found religion, and he started doing some televangelizing and giving a bunch of money to charities. And so once it went to trial, they couldn't get a jury of 12 people to convict this sort of mini celebrity in the area, beyond, to come to the conclusion beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had actually committed this fraud. So several of the CFOs, were convicted of fraud, and they asked one of them, well, how did Scrushy get you to do it? He said, well, Scrushy realized that if you pay people enough, you get the behavior that you want, right? It creates a golden handcuff. So he was hiring these CFOs, paying more than what they could make anywhere else, and they were basically paid off to commit fraud, right? One individual, basically said, I'm not comfortable doing this, but he also knew he wasn't really qualified to be the CFO. And they just said, just do, Scrushy just basically convinced him to do it for a short period of time, and then he could move to another place within the organization, and he would be handsomely rewarded. So you can just pay people, right? The other one is you can coerce them. You could just threaten them that you're going to fire them, you're going to punish them, if they don't do what you want. And that happens periodically as well, especially to like mid-level managers, who feel a lot of pressure, and they say, if you don't perform, we're going to fire you. The other is expert power, and that's a good example of that is at WorldCom. So at WorldCom, in the late 1990s, early 2000s was a bad time for the telecommunication industry, and WorldCom sales were basically flat, but their expenses were continuing to go up, and they were starting to lose money. And they didn't want to look like they were losing money, so they decided, well, we've got to get rid of some of our expenses. So what they decided to do was at the end of the quarter and at the end of the year, they would look at what their expenses were, and they said, well, that's too much. So they would just credit the expense and just debit fixed assets. So they would take legitimate expenses off the income statement and just put them on the balance sheet as fixed assets. And then their income looked a lot better when obviously after they did that. And the way they got the lower level managers to go along with this scheme was they basically told them that they didn't really understand the telecommunications business, and that this represented prepaid capacity, which is a made-up term to explain why they would take legitimate expenses and call them fixed assets. They would say, you know what, you don't really understand the industry as well as we do. We're the CEO, the CFO. We understand, how this process works. Those expenses were recorded sort of prematurely, so we're going to put them back, call them fixed assets, and it's just prepaid capacity. Just go ahead and make those adjustments, and you'll understand it later as you become more knowledgeable about the industry. So you can exert expert power, right? That you have special knowledge that the other person doesn't have, and they just need to go along with what you ask them to do. But the other one's legitimate power. There's been a lot of psychology studies that basically show that people do what they're told. So if your boss tells you to do something, you just do it, right? You don't question it. That's just what bosses do. They tell you to do stuff and you do it. And if you're not concerned that maybe it's unethical, it's just basically like, well, I was told to do it. It was their decision. It's not on me. And so you just do what you're told, right? And that's a surprisingly powerful tool to recruit people to do nefarious things. And then, so the last one here is referent power. And that's where, if you're the CFO and you're trying to get the controller to go along with you, you become friends with the controller, become a bit of their mentor. They want to be like you. And so you can just coerce them to do what you want because, you sort of explain to them, this is how things are done at my level, right? And, you want to be like me and we're friends. And so you just convince them through kind of the force of your personality and your friendship with the individual to get them to do it, right? So those are the types of power that people are able to use to recruit people into their scheme, right? And so you have this pressure that the conspirator feels, and so they exercise one of these different types of power on the co-conspirator. And this co-conspirator, feels like they're getting paid to do it, or they're scared because they're going to get fired, or they just think, well, this person knows more than me, so I'm going to go along with it, or I just need to because they told me to do it, right? Or we're friends, and I want to be like him, and so I'm going to go along with this fraud, right? So there's the different types of power that they exert, and I've done a study on this to see if CFOs of companies that commit fraud actually receive more money than companies that don't commit fraud. Well, we find that it doesn't look like they do. It doesn't look like CFOs benefit financially from it. They do it out of either referent power from the CEO or may possibly fear punishment. So these are the 5 types of power that occur, and hopefully, as we study these types of things, that you'll be able to, if you get in a work environment where people are trying to exert this type of power over you to do things that you feel are maybe unethical, that you can remember this and think, well, gosh, they're using legitimate power. They're trying to reward me to do something that I don't feel comfortable doing. And maybe if Walt Pavlo had done that early on, he could have walked away from and recognized that and walked away before he committed fraud. So that's a breakdown of why people commit fraud, and then we'll move to chapter 3 next.